Tervetuloa yleisö jälleen taiteilijahaastattelun pariin tänne Mikkeliin. Tällä kertaa meillä on uusia kasvoja orkesterin edessä. Tervetuloa kantele taiteilija Hedi Viisma. And welcome also our conductor James Kahane. This is a first visit for both of you with our orchestra in Mikkeli. It has been 2 days now here in Mikkeli. How is it going, James, first of all? What are your first feelings about the orchestra and the hall and the city?
Well, first of all, the city is surprisingly warm at this time of the year. I expected something more winterish. I expected -25 or -30, and actually the weather is quite more than tolerable. So this is the first good surprise. Then the hall that you have here, I think you're very blessed. You have a really nice hall that is perfect for the size of the orchestra, which is quite compact. So it has actually been a treat to work in this hall, because it's true that in Helsinki this kind of traditional largish halls that really suit orchestras are surprisingly rare in my experience. And finally, of course, the orchestra is lovely. It's full of people that really want to play beautiful, and the first instinct of this orchestra is to produce beautiful sound, which is something wonderful, because it gives you, let's say, if you're a cook and you make food and you have people that give you already from the start, they give you the best ingredients. This already is a privilege.
Entäs Hedi, minkälaisen tunnelmin nyt Mikkelissä ja Mikaelissa orkesterin edessä?
On ollut todella mukavaa tulla tänne ja päästä soittamaan. Ja erityisen kivaa on ollut se, että aikaisemmin olen soittanut erilaisissa semmoisissa keikkaluontoisissa orkestereissa, missä ihmiset, hyvät soittajat kyllä tulevat yhteen, valmistellaan konsertti ja sitten soitetaan. Mutta huomaan kyllä, että silloin kun orkesteri on soittanut pitkään yhdessä, niin kyllä siinä eri tavalla ihmiset kuuntelevat toisiaan ja se yhteissoitto. Että kyllä siinä on vaikutusta, että pääsee soittamaan orkesterin kanssa, joka muutenkin soittaa yhdessä paljon.
Okay, so it's good to hear that the city and the orchestra has made a good impact so far. Let's start going through the program. We start with Gustav Holst, St. Paul's Suite. Gustav Holst used to work in a girls' school called the St. Paul's Girls' School, and this piece comes from there. It's composed originally for the children in the girls' school, but it's not children's music, or it's not too simple, or is it, James? How do you see the piece?
Well, of course, I think it's a piece that balances quite adequately some challenges for players to overcome, which I think he wrote consciously. I think he decided to consciously write a piece that is pretty, in French we say abordable, so pretty easy to grasp technically, so that it doesn't represent too much individual challenges, so that basically all the girls from this girls' school could basically play it and enjoy it. And at the same time, he writes some details and let's say the togetherness of the orchestra is more challenging than it seems at first eye. And so basically, to summarize, technically pretty easy piece, pretty nice and enjoyable. Then when the point is to make it come together and work together as an orchestra and get really good sound, pace everything correctly, then it's slightly more challenging.
Yes, so how would you describe the music of the piece? It's got 4 movements. How would you describe the music itself?
Well, first of all, I would say that it's a music that very much, and this is a underlying theme in the whole program, that is very much rooted in some form of folk music. I think there are lots of folk tunes. The first one, for example, that comes evidently to mind is the Fantasia on Green Sleeves, the Green Sleeves variation thing that comes at the end of the piece. But also just generally the texture that comes, for example, the first movement that is very like going. It's basically, even though it's not a folk tune taken from somewhere, it's evidently a sort of celebration of gathering of, let's say, folk players, folk string players. And in my opinion, the way I see the piece, it's very much a tribute to this sort of simple and straightforward way that these sort of traveling musicians had to do music. So yes, in essence, it's very much this folk element is in my opinion, the most important thing about the piece.
Right. James tässä mainitsikin kansanmusiikkiteema, joka on vähän kantava teema koko konsertin läpi. Ja sitten siirrytään tietysti suomalaisittain sinne kansanmusiikin ytimeen, kanteleeseen. Hedi, sinä soitat tässä konsertissa Matthew Whitallin Five Windows on Winter konserton kanteleelle ja jousille. Ja se on nimenomaan kromaattiselle kanteleelle. Lähdetäänpä siitä liikkeelle, että kuvailisitko vähän, että minkälainen on kromaattinen kantele, miten se eroaa siitä perinteisestä, minkä me kaikki suomalaiset tiedämme?
No kun kantele on sellaista pienestä kanteleista, 5-6-kielisestä kehittynyt, mitä kaikki muskarissa soittaa ja kaikki suomalaiset soittaa melkein, tai on ainakin kokeillut, niin tämä kromaattisen kantelen versio on kehitetty itse asiassa Virossa. Että joskus 1900-luvulla kun kantelen koko lähti kasvamaan, niin sitten lähdettiin modernisoimaan niitä soittimia, että sillä pystyisi soittamaan enemmän ja enemmän. Ja 20-30-luvulla kehitettiin Suomessa se konserttikantele, mitä kaikki tietävät. Ja sitä voisi verrata siihen, että meillä olisi piano, missä on vain valkoiset koskettimet. Ja sitten kun halutaan saada se musta kosketin, niin sitten täällä on sellaisia vipuja, mistä käännetään. Että vähän samalla ajatuksella kuin harppu, missä on pedaalilla, saadaan ne mustat koskettimet noin sanotusti. Ja sitten Viron puolella 50-luvulla kehitettiin kromaattinen kantele, missä on kaikki kielet erikseen. Eli se on niin kuin pikku piano. Ja mun kanteleen on rakentanut Otto Koistinen. Se valmistui yhteistyötä vuonna 2010. Halusin sellaisen kanteleen, mikä on vähän isompi kuin niillä muilla, että siellä olisi enemmän niitä bassonuotteja. Että se on kuulemma todella hankala rakentaa ihan sen takia, että kantele itse on pelkästään puuta ja metalli on vaan kielet ja noi tapit siinä. Ja sitten jos rakentaa kovan laatikon, vahvan laatikon, mikä kestää sitä kielten jännitystä, niin sitten se kantele ei soi. Mutta sitten kun rakentaa taas semmoisen, mikä soi vähän paremmin, niin sitten voi olla, että kielten jännitys on liikaa. Niin tosiaan siitä on tullut se kromaattinen kantele malli.
Kromaattinen kantele on varmasti, tai onkin tietysti ihan erilainen soittaa kuin se konserttikantele, kun jokaiselle äänelle on oma kieli. Onko se niin kantelepiireissä, että kromaattiseen kanteleeseen ikään kuin erikoistutaan sitten, jos sitä halutaan, vai kuuluuko ne automaattisesti yhteen?
Ei, kun ne on eri soittimia, vähän samalla tavalla kuin viulu ja alttoviulu, että ne näyttää samalta ja nimikin vähän kuulostaa samalta, mutta kyllä ne on eri soittimia, että totta kai sitten voi erikoistua eri kantelemalleihin ja näin, mutta että ne on eri soittimia ihan täysin.
Aivan. No, sanotaanpa muutama sana tästä kappaleesta nyt sitten solistin näkökulmasta. Miten lähtisit avaamaan tätä kappaletta? Minkälainen kantelekonsertti me tullaan kuulemaan?
Se on hyvin kuvamainen, kuvallinen musiikki. 5 ikkunaa talveen. Ja siinä tosiaan voi kuulla niitä talven eri muotoja. Että siellä on iloista pulkkamäkeä ja siellä on karua ja synkkää ja jäätävää Lappi-maisemaa, yötä, varjojen peliä, aurinkoa tulee ulos, joulua, iloa, lämpöä ja myöskin kaipua ja surua siitä, että nyt on harvemmin ja harvemmin semmoista kaunista postikorttimaista talvea, missä on paljon lunta.
All right, James, we discussed about the history of kantele, and now Hedi has also described the piece that we're gonna play, but it's interesting because you don't know what she said. So
That's all right. We talked about it.
So how does the Matthew Whithole's kantele concerto appear to the conductor?
Well, that's a good question. We actually talked about it yesterday. It's a surprisingly tricky concerto for the conductor. Or maybe it's just me that feels it's tricky, but I actually, in some weird way that I can't really explain, it's one of the most tricky concertos that I've conducted because it's modern enough that there are challenges, let's say, all kinds of things to put together that are pretty difficult, and on the same time it's clearly post-tonal tonal enough that that you can really hear if everything is not 100% in place. The rhythms are very clear, the harmonies are very clear, so you have a responsibility as the conductor to really make sure that everything is 100% perfect in terms of togetherness, in terms of intonation as well, because if it is not the case, it's extremely audible. So the fact that in this aspect the piece is so unforgiving, which doesn't mean that the piece is bad at all. On the contrary, I think it's something that vouches for the quality of the piece, is something that adds an extra layer of challenge for the conductor, which is, in my opinion, not there in most of the concertos I've done until now.
Yeah, and usually a concerto is where the soloist instrument is a soloist, but in this piece this is not really the case, or is it?
Joo, kantele ei ole erikseen niin kuin solistimaisesti, vaan se on osana sitä. Siinä on soolopätkiä, mutta kyllä se soittaa ikään kuin yhdessä orkesterin seassa se kantele. Ja mitä teknisiin vaikeuksiin James kertoi, niin kyllä kantelellekin tämä on siis kirjoitettu tilausteoksena tohtoritutkintoon, missä tutkin kanteleen soittotekniikkaan niin kuin kehittämistä ja mahdollisuuksia ja niitä rajoja, niin siinä kappaleessa ne kyllä kaikki tekniset haasteetkin löytyy sitten erilaisissa korukuvioissa ja ehkä semmoisissa soittotekniikoissa, mitä aikaisemmin ei kantelemusiikista löydy.
Yeah, on my side, the way I see it, the way it feels is that the orchestra is used to expand the sound universe of the kantele. So in that sense, it's maybe not the traditional dialogue. It's more that the kantele gives a certain image and the orchestra is there to further the image reach and basically create a sound universe that fits very well with the kantele sound.
I agree. It's very good.
Yeah, it's a really truly inspiring and exciting piece. Sort of magical is the first word that comes to my mind.
Yes.
Magical feel throughout the whole piece.
Yeah.
All right, after the short intermission, we're gonna hear Piotr Tchaikovsky Souvenirs from Florence. It's originally composed for a string sextet, so chamber music from a conductor who is usually known for big ballets and operas and symphonies. What kind of a challenge does this chamber music from Tchaikovsky bring to the orchestra and the conductor?
Well, the first thing that comes to mind is definitely the balance. Because what happens in a string sextet is that you have two violins, one per voice, two violas, also one per voice, and two cellos. The thing is that when you expand it to an orchestra version, especially because the arrangements that we play are basically exactly the same as the sextet, except there is a bass line. So what happens is that the one violin voice technically gets multiplied by 4, because suddenly you have 4 first violins. The second violins also get multiplied, but then what happens with the violas is that they remain 1 per voice, and the same thing goes with the cello. So the first thing is that how within the orchestra setting find exactly the same balance where every line and all these dialogues that are important to have correctly balanced on the same volume, how to make sure that that even though the size of each group is different, very different actually, how to make sure that everything is heard the same and that every element appears as convincingly as possible, regardless of which section plays it. And this is a very important challenge that I think should not be misunderstood and underestimated, because there are many details in the piece that sometimes even in the sextet iterations, performances, you don't hear.
Yes, it's a very complex piece, if you like. What would be the things that you would like the audience to hear or listen in the piece? Are there some, you mentioned details, is the beauty in the details in this piece?
Yes, I think, but this is very personal and I would not want to, let's say, force audience to listen in a certain way, but I can certainly say that on my side, the details are important, but they are not important for themselves. They are important because they serve the storytelling. And I think one interesting thing about Tchaikovsky is that one way or another, all his pieces tell a story. And the story, I'm certain that the way he conceived it is pretty abstract, but if we as performers make the effort to really have an image, a sort of narrative image of the piece, let's say we've really precisely here this, I picture that this happens and here another, like suddenly something else happened and this in a manner that is really coherent, then all the details that are important to do make sense because they serve basically a larger narrative structure. And as I said, what is really most remarkable about Tchaikovsky is that I'm pretty sure that he didn't consciously intend the piece to have a story, but it was certainly subconsciously here. Like, I think his writing is always motivated by the personal drama he experienced, by his environment, by the way he was, let's say, integrated in the society, by his personal stories. And even though to his mind he was probably like writing music following a certain set of rules, actually I think this narrative element is really present. So on my side, basically the most important is to really convey a story. I really imagine that it's like an opera, except the stage is invisible and the singers are the orchestras. And my mission is to basically convey a story that is moving and powerful and that makes people like feel all kinds of emotion even though they don't really know why.
Well, that's a good description of a piece. So that's a good way to conclude this interview. Thank you very much, Hedi Viisma, and thank you, James Kahane. Ja tervetuloa hyvää yleisö kuuntelemaan konserttia semilive.fi-palveluun.